According to UN reports, between 15,000 and 20,000 people are killed every year via landmines. This affects people throughout 78 countries around the world, and largely women and children. And even more disturbing is that these are the result of landmines laid for decades, not just what's happening today. Digital marketing agency Critical Mass, along with the United Nations Mine Action Service, collaborated on a landmine simulation application called Sweeper. Leveraging iBeacon technology, geofencing, and a mobile app, they were able to plant invisible landmines within an exhibit space in which users would come across these, they would explode, and they would get a horrifying message reminding them of the effects of landmines on people. Here today we have Conor Brady, the Chief Creative Officer for Critical Mass, here to talk deeper about the work.
Morning. Nice to get you all before lunch and Twitter fatigue. So we're here to talk about Sweeper, a project we did in April this year. And I'll give you some insight into how we set the project up, what we did, and then maybe in the theme of some of the things we talked about already, some of the learnings that we had after it. There's a lot of agencies in the room, and every agency loves their logo wall. This was a logo I'd wanted on our logo wall for a really long time. It's the United Nations logo. Our office is pretty close to the building in New York. It's pretty iconic, and it's a pretty iconic agency, if you want to call it what they are. If you talk about politics within clients, this is a pretty political client, as you can imagine. But also one that I've been very lucky and honored to work with. When I was traveling with one of these guys as we were talking about the project and they were educating us on what they were doing for the mine activation service, you go through customs and they ask you what you do at customs. My description is I'm a designer, I design websites. And the guy behind me from the United Nations said this, I organize coordinated responses to the remnants of war. It's a pretty cool way to describe what you do for the world. It gives you a sense and purpose of what these guys have. They're incredible individuals and you learn a lot from working with them. But the activation service is one organization within the United Nations alongside things like UNICEF and the other things that they do that focuses on doing exactly this, which is pretty incredible. The education component for us, and I, there's an irony here. I mean, I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland, so you have a guy talking about bombs and removing bombs. It was the joke that ran through the United Nations project every single time we talked about it. They have a very light way of discussing this and sort of educating people with it. There's 110 million mines left in the world across 70 countries as it stands today. And that doesn't include any unexploded ordnance. So that's the stuff that gets dropped from planes, basically. So there's an incredible task, and their goal is to remove all of this in our lifetime. And they're actually making progress in doing it as well, which is pretty amazing. This is typically what they deal with. They take that stuff out of the ground on the left, and they deal with that stuff on the right, which is things like cluster bombs. And if you think about what happens whenever a conflict stops, civilization, like ourselves, have to go back into these areas afterwards and get on with regular life. And it's pretty hard to get on with regular life when things like this are sitting in your playground, or sitting in your background, or sitting out in your front street, which is actually what's happening. So that's the job that they do. Where they typically get money is inside this room. And this room is where they talk to humanitarian organizations. The United Nations itself has a number of funds where they give money. That's how they generate money to fund doing this. It's a very expensive task. It's very labor intensive, and it requires a lot of manpower to actually get into these countries to do this and remove the ordnance. So this is typically where they go. And we had a conversation with these guys. We met them by complete chance. I happened to know someone that works at the Irish Embassy. I got invited to a dinner. I met a guy. He had a conversation. That's how the project started. And they asked me, what could you do to help us? You're a digital agency. You're used to marketing. You're a designer. You have a number of skills that we don't have within Mine Activation Service. What can you do? And that was with Agnes, who runs United Nations Mine Activation Service. And she basically said, well, what can you do by April 4th, which is what they call Mine Activation Day. They do it around the world. It's where they activate within governments and organizations to raise money that can raise public awareness. They don't typically go to the likes of us to get money to fund this. They don't typically go to us to help raise awareness, because up until this point, the impact that they were having was going directly to governments and organizations and having them be the ones that sort of make this happen. So the problem we had when we were having this conversation, we had 6 weeks. So this was 6 weeks before April 4th, where they were saying, you've got 6 weeks, what can you do? So it really, you know, in the way that agencies like to work, that tends to be well, we can't really do anything. You know, there's time frames and whatever. So we sort of stepped back and really started to think about it as kind of like 6 by 6. And this is kind of something that we've started to do now. And it's actually really, really helping us. And the 6 by 6 is 6 people for 6 weeks. So it's a very small team. Each discipline is represented by one person. And what we do is essentially have this group come together and just focus on this task in hand with a very quick, nimble deadline. And it worked. And, you know, I think this just us as an agency, if you think we're 700 people across 9 countries, whatever, that's actually a pretty hard thing to do, because it's not typically how we work. It's not typically in our culture. So that was something we did internally, because I think there was a lot of passion and energy around helping these guys and trying to figure something out. But we had a bit of a head start. We weren't starting from scratch. We had something called the Shed, and it literally started in a shed in the London office. And what it is, it's really cultural space and kind of mental space and physical space for people to go play with technology. So in there's things like iBeacons, Arduino kits, the typical stuff you would have to sort of hack technology together and play with things. So it wasn't like we were starting cold whenever we got this brief. What can you do for April 4th? We already had some things we thought might be kind of interesting, and we started to think about those in the context of what we could do for the Mine Activation Service. So inside the Shed, one of the things that we were doing, we'd got our hands on an iBeacon kit, and it was pretty early at this point. And we were playing around with it. We'd set it up in the office, and we were starting to play with triggering content and triggering interactions and triggering video and audio, and starting to think about what could we do with this just as experimentation. So we had a number of experiments that were going. But also within the context of the Shed and how we worked, we started to think about in the physical space, you know, what can we do? And there was a kind of interesting tension that started to happen. I'm a designer by trade. I'm not a technologist. I love technology, but I'm a designer. So my focus was primarily on that top part, the visible part that sits between the consumer and the experience, or in this case, the sort of the audience. And we were kind of breaking that down into 2 components. There's the content that you're going to see, what you're going to experience, and the environment, or the area that you're going to experience it in. And that's basically kind of the control environment. What can we do? What can we control? The bottom part of that is, to me, is the code and the data and the technology that sits in there. And we were kind of calling that the invisible part, because it was kind of encouraging to hear early in the panel this morning talking about the emotion or emotive technology. And that's kind of where we were going with this. We kind of believe that a lot of this technology should stay invisible. It should be empowering and enabling. And actually what you should see as a user or an audience should be content and experience and environment. And the interaction is the thing that brings these things together. So that's kind of how we were thinking. And we were asking these types of questions of ourselves, what's the audience going to be open to? It's like we're sort of bombarded by stuff all of the time. What can we do that's not going to be intrusive, might be engaging, might be interesting? What can we control? So you think about the physical environment. What's within our remit to control? Is it audio? Is it light? Is it physical space? What can we do there? What platforms can we use? Are we putting something into the space to make it happen? In this case, iBeacons. Are we using technology already in our pockets? Are we combining those 2 things together? What content do we present? So in a lot of cases, when we do these types of things, we have to create the content as well. The clients don't have it. So we might shoot video, we might record audio. In the case of Mine Activation Service, they had amazing content, photographic and filmic. What they didn't have was audio, so we created a whole audio design that was part of this to complete the experience. And then the last part, what sort of reaction do we want to elicit from this? What do we want people to do? What do we want to happen once they pass through this sort of physical space? So those were the questions that we were asking, doing that anyway. So that's where the 2 things came together. That conversation that happened, United Nations asking us, what could you do? Us thinking like this, and we brought those 2 things together. So that's kind of where we started. So to talk a little bit about the barriers to doing this. So it's a really worthy cause, but it's not the only really worthy cause out there. There's a lot out there. And when you start to talk inside organizations like this, and you do your own research around kind of cause marketing or charities or giving, the idea of giving, it's a very full market. There's a lot of people vying for your attention. And if you talk to psychologists, they call it carrying capacity. We've only got so much carrying capacity. There's only so much caring we can do, considering there's so much out there to care about. And there was a staggering, and I think this was just in the UK, there's over 5,000 new charities every year in the UK alone. So if you think about that, the proliferation of people wanting your money, people want you to put your hand in your pocket to help, it's a hard thing to break through. So there's also what they call charity relevance. We tend to ignore the problems that don't impact us directly, or where we can't sort of see immediate benefit for where we're actually making a difference. And that was something that we read a lot about and thought it was kind of interesting, because whilst this is a very shocking thing that they're doing or trying to fix and cure, it's not happening at an alarming rate. So there's this idea of we got very desensitized to stuff. And it's really hard to shock us now to sort of into doing something. It's hard to shock us out of that sort of sleepwalk that we're in. So the idea of like putting some of these photographs up, and there's photographs of people who've been maimed by this, that wasn't working. They tried that. It wasn't working. It's not enough anymore to do that. So it really started us to ask the question, what can we do? The other thing that's really interesting if you read about it, and there's been lots of studies, and it's this idea of scope insensitivity, is that presenting someone with the scale of a problem actually makes them switch off. So if you tell someone there's 110 million mines left in the world around 70 countries, that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. In fact, it actually puts them off, because it seems impenetrable for them to be able to actually step in and help and do something. So these were like some of the barriers that we were kind of dealing with and trying to figure out how we do this. And one of the things that we realized just in talking to people, this is before we touch design, touch technology, is where people get really emotional about it is when you tell them a one-to-one story. When you tell them a story about a certain person where this happened, something happens there on a very personal level where all of a sudden they lean in and they're interested. So you go from that 110 million mines down to one mine did this. And that's when people start to sort of want to do something about it and help, because it connects on an emotional level. And we tend to want to do that. We tend to want to give to those things where we can see that we can have a difference in that person's life. I think that was the learning for us as designers. And believe me, before we touched this project, none of us understood this space. None of us really understood what the United Nations do, what they deal with, the idea of charity and the idea of politics and the idea of getting people to give money. We're not experts in that. But we did learn a lot from talking to experts, and the United Nations can connect you to some very interesting people, as you can imagine, that can give you the sort of insight that you need to do this. The other thing we were doing this in New York, right? So we were going to do this day in New York. New Yorkers are thick-skinned. They are fickle, and it's really hard to get their attention. So add all of that to the fact that we're doing it in New York, it sort of becomes a whole other problem. Believe me, I live there. So the way we sort of started to think about this is, can we use this technology, iBeacon technology, and not talk about it like it's iBeacon technology, but can we use it to make people feel something? And in doing that, actually get them to contribute. So those were some of the barriers that we came up with. In doing this, we met this incredibly handsome man. This is a guy called Marco Grob. And whilst you may not know Marco Grob, you will know his work. Marco has photographed everybody from Obama to Bush to Clinton to De Niro to Pacino, for GQ, for Esquire. He does magazine covers. He is an incredible photographer. But he only does that for 8 months a year. The other 4 months of the year, he travels to war zones and documents what happens there for Mine Activation Service for free. So it's pretty incredible. And all of the work that he does, and I'll show you some of the images in a minute, they're amazing. I mean, they're amazing photographs in their own right. And what he does is he gives that work to Mine Activation Service and says, use it how you want. So he makes his money for the 8 months of the year photographing amazing people, and then he goes around the world doing incredible good. This guy knows how to move barriers, I can assure you. He's one of the most passionate people I've ever met. He's also German. He doesn't like project management. So he said something in one of the meetings that made me stop in my tracks, because we'd all been talking about the 110,000 million mines around the world. He said if there was one single mine in New York City, that whole city would stand still. He's absolutely right. If that went on CNN and said, there's a mine somewhere in New York, you wouldn't see anyone in the streets. I mean, it would change everything for that day. And it really made us think, well, maybe we should actually do that, which coming from Belfast is kind of bizarre. But that's how we started to think about this. Maybe we can do something that sort of connects with people and really makes them sit up and think about this differently. This is some of Marco's pictures. I just pulled a couple. This was some of the stuff that he had shot. I mean, they're pretty incredible. These are all victims of mines and what's happened after conflict has left, and these people have gone back into their own areas to live, and they've stepped on something, they've been hit by a cluster bomb that's gone off. These are survivors, by the way, not the people. There's a lot of people who don't. So he has an incredible body of work that we started to think about, well, if we have this body of work, which people really want to see, because it was due an exhibition. He'd been documenting this stuff for 5 or 6 years. It had never been shown, except inside the United Nations. So we started to think about there's a body of work here that we can use to sort of get people's attention in a very different way. And we started to think about, well, can we simulate a minefield and get that sort of emotional reaction we want and actually get people to care about it and do something. So with Marco, and as you can imagine, he's a pretty connected guy, we went to here, which is the new museum in New York. It's an incredible space. Mostly does kind of modern installation art. We were going there a lot. We know some of the people there, and we went to them and we proposed doing an exhibition of Marco's work. We didn't tell them at the time we were going to rig the museum full of digital mines. We said, positioned it purely as an exhibition. And they agreed, unbeknown what's going to happen. And really what we did is, what's on the left is the United Nations also collects the artifacts of conflict. So they have all of these mines. So we thought, well, that's interesting, because you could actually make a pretty cool exhibition of beautiful photography, the stories behind the photographs, and the things that maimed people in the pictures. It's an incredibly powerful kind of show in itself. On the right is what we were saying is the digital equivalent of that mine. It's the iBeacon, and what we were going to do was turn those iBeacons into have a digital explosion, if you want to call it, as to what would happen if you stepped on the thing on the left. So we partnered with a company called Buma, who the New Museum put us in touch with, who are exhibition designers. We had an idea of what we wanted to do physically, how we wanted people to pass through the space, and sort of under the guise of coming into an exhibition, being told, hey, look, there's an audio tour for this exhibition. Here are the stories behind this. You walk into the exhibition. You're encouraged to take your phone out, download the app, which was a 10-second download on the free Wi-Fi, put your headphones in, and go enjoy the exhibition. And we wanted people to walk through the exhibition without really telling them what was going to happen. And so this was just some of the sketches we did for the exhibition, and how we would sort of position Marco's work and the connection to the United Nations. So that was your kind of first impression. There was 2 sides to the app that we did. The front side of the app had no clue as to what was going to happen to you whenever you passed through the exhibition. It was purely a guide. So think of this in the context of, I have headphones on, and we had done audio design where there was a voiceover talking to you about the work that Mine Activation Services does, talking to you about Marco and what he does, and you're kind of guided literally around the exhibition. The second part of it was whenever you triggered something, I'm going to play a film in a minute so you can see, we documented today so you'll get a sense of what it does. The second part of the app, which was the flip side of it, was once you triggered something, it actually told you what you just stood on. Not literally, but metaphorically. And what it did was it sort of said what it was and the damage that it would do to you if you'd stepped on a real one. And also just the facts and figures that sit behind that, how many of them are left in the world. It was, kind of an educational component. But at the end of it, the trick was to get people to donate in that moment, because we had you, quite frankly. We had you by the heart, and we had you, hopefully, your hand in your pocket. And that was the goal, was to sort of really use this sort of moment, in that moment, to get you to donate. So that was all of our planning. That was the way we thought about it. We got to this point with the exhibition being built, fabricated, the night before on the 3rd. So you can imagine the 6 weeks is a interesting timeline to work in, but we got this done in 6 weeks. And we actually hadn't really even prototyped it. Well, we had prototyped it, but we hadn't made it, like, see it work completely until we went into the space on the morning of the 4th. So it was a little bit of a, considering we had the ambassador of Japan showing up, it was a little bit nervous, but it worked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a film. It's only a couple of minutes, and it sort of documents the day. It shows real people who'd come into the new museum, had come to see an exhibition downstairs, saw that there was an exhibition upstairs, and wanted to sort of wander in and become part of it and see what happens. So you'll get a sense of what goes on here.
Landmines, IEDs, unexploded ordnance, artillery shells and cluster bombs. You've just triggered a VS 2.2 explosive device. You've just triggered a Prom 1 Bouncing Betty explosive device. These grim weapons don't discriminate. They kill civilian and soldier alike. The Black Widow PMN mine contains more explosive. The M77 is fitted with a parachute like the AO 2.5 has an approximate kill radius of 20 meters. Right here and right now, you are surrounded by landmines.
So that's the piece. So the thank you. What doesn't come across, and it's hard in these presentations whenever you talk about digital in the physical space and you're not in that physical space, is that audio component that we designed was it literally did scare the shit out of you. Like whenever you were walking around, is if you walk around an exhibition and you're kind of looking at art, you're in this kind of very cerebral, like, oh, this is beautiful, look at this. And all of a sudden this thing went off in your head. And it was sort of done to be sort of that sort of shock. And it really worked. And I mean, you see it in some of the people's expressions, but it's actually a really hard thing to capture. You have to be in the room and kind of feel it, see it, and watch what happens to these people. So that was, that was that. What we learned, scope and sensitivity. What became really clear in this was, ask people for a small contribution in that moment, and it really worked. And we didn't know this going into it. We didn't really think that wasn't what we were trying to do, but it's how we made it happen. And there was two ways you could donate. You could add it to your phone bill, because we had AT&T was one of our clients, so we did a deal. Where at the end of it, I could just say, yes, I want to donate, and it would show up as a line item in your phone bill. So we made it frictionless and very, very easy for you to participate. Did it work? The year before, they'd sort of done a social media campaign to try and raise awareness and get some donations. We managed to get them 152% increase in donations. So it was a big success for them. And this was just one day. You got to remember, one day, 6 weeks worth of work. It did a lot for them. The thing that made me most happy was that afterwards we got good press, and Contagious kind of summed it up, I think, in a very long report that Contagious does very well. But they started to talk about the use of this type of technology, not to be purely utilitarian in the idea of delivering an offer or something that happens inside a retail space. They started to talk about it in the sense of it sort of triggered emotion, it triggered an emotional experience, it triggered a much bigger, broader type of experience that went from audio to design to interaction to physical space. And that's really, for us, what we hope to get out of this project more than anything. And I think the three takeaways that I personally walked away was that it really made us think about how this type of technology should remain invisible, at least to that type of audience, because it doesn't really resonate with them. It's not the thing that they're there to see. It's really about what's it doing, what's it enabling. It also enables you to design complete experiences. I think audio is probably one of the most overlooked components of experience design. I used to work in the music industry, so I love music and audio design. So for me, the ability now to do this type of thing triggered by these types of technologies in physical space, I think is where that sort of complete experience design can go, which I think is really interesting. And maybe more importantly than any is that connect with the person, not with the phone. Like we talk a lot about using the phone and the technology in our pocket and how we bring these things together. Yes, we all need to understand and figure that out, but at the same time, we're actually trying to connect with people. And that's really, in the context of something like this, is where you're actually going to make a difference. And what happens next? So with all of these projects, they've always got a life that goes on, especially when they have the success we had with this one. We built a prototype, and that prototype became a pilot in the new museum. Now that we're actually currently adapting it to be a permanent exhibit inside the United Nations building. So now whenever you do the United Nations tour, which they're going to open up again in December, you will pass through this experience. It also means that every government member walking to the General Assembly going forward will also pass through this experience. So hopefully it can start to influence both public and governmental in the way that it works going forward. So it's that's what's next for it. And that is it. Thanks. I don't know if there's any questions. Don't be shy. I'm not. One at the back.
So, pretty impressive, the 6 weeks of work. How long into the project did it take you to sort of begin to really kind of define what you were going through? How much conceptual versus how much would have been forward?
I think out of the 6 weeks, we probably spent, I would say, at least 50% of the time, maybe 60% of the time building, figuring it out, the mechanics of it, how it worked, both the physical exhibition side of it, what that was going to be. The first 2 weeks was really, we knew we had Marco's work. We knew we had the new museum agreed to do it. And we knew that we wanted to do something using iBeacon technology as a metaphor for a mine. So we knew that at the start of the 6 weeks. Then we had essentially 2 weeks that were really about, okay, what's the artifact of this look like? What's it feel like? You know, what's the design look like? You know, what, like actually designing the experience, both from the mobile experience, the interaction design that was on there and how we presented that content, to the physical exhibition design, to the audio design. What type of audio design do we want? And then once we got out of that 2 weeks, when we started to look at those components, the last 4 weeks was all making. And, you know, it was 6 people, but the reality is when we got towards the 5.5 week time frame, there was about 12 people. That happened whenever we were first introduced to Marco, and we were talking to him about the possibility of using this work in the exhibition, and he was like, went on what became known as a Marco rant, which would go on for about 15 minutes, and he was more than happy to give us the photographs and thought this was amazing that we were working on this, and went on his speech. In that, he said, what's amazing is, if we did this in New York, one single mine in New York, this would change everything. The whole city would stop. And I just remember, it just stuck with us as we were listening to him. And it became a thing that we walked away with the next day. And when we all came in that next morning and talked about the meeting the night before, we all kind of had written that down. And to me, that was he's absolutely right. I mean, it was just a basic human truth. If you want to shock New Yorkers, get their attention, it's like you threaten their safety or you threaten the sort of the environment that they live in. Or at least you give the perception of that's what's happening. And it worked. I mean, it really worked. So it took an outsider to bring that insight, which was also kind of incredible. I think that's it. Thank you.